Every town has a dark side. What happened in today's case is so extreme that even investigators struggled to put it into words. Not because the facts were unclear, but because the intent behind them never was. And the violence here wasn't fast or chaotic, and it wasn't random. It was very brutal and totally deliberate. This episode involves the murder of an entire family. I won't dwell on the graphic details, but the reality of what was done here matters because it shaped the entire investigation, and it's an ugly one. And if you're listening somewhere quiet or late at night, you might want to take that into account before we go any further. Hey guys, it's Andrew. Welcome to Every Town, where today we're checking out one of the most violent unsolved murders Illinois has ever seen. This is the case of the Derdeen family murders. Ena, Illinois was the kind of town that you can miss if you blink. It has about 2,000 people in it, one stoplight, and there's an Uncle Joe's barbecue where you can grab a solid fried bologna sandwich. They have a gas station, a funeral home, and then, well, just space. The kind of place where people know who you are before you even meet, where for a long time people didn't think twice about leaving their doors unlocked at night. But by the late 1980s, that sense of ease had started to slip a bit. In just 2 years, Jefferson County had seen 15 homicides. On paper, that might not sound alarming, especially if you're thinking in terms of cities, but here, in farm towns and back roads and places where violent crime was something that happened somewhere else, it felt enormous. And people most definitely started double-checking their locks around this time. The shotgun stayed propped up in truck windows and behind front doors. And the quiet confidence that defined small-town life here had been replaced with something tighter, more watchful. Keith and Elaine Derdeen arrived in Ena the year before all this came to a head. And Keith was 29, working at a local water treatment facility. Elaine was 30, commuting to Mount Vernon, where she worked at an office supply store. They had a 2-year-old son, Peter, and by the fall of 1987, Elaine was 7 months pregnant with their second child. They had already chosen names, Ian if it was a boy, Casey if it was a girl. Decisions made in the ordinary, hopeful way that young families make them. Nothing about the Derdeens was especially noteworthy or even interesting. That's not a dig, it's just the reality. They were a quiet and predictable family living in southern Illinois. Attended the local Baptist church where Keith sang and Elaine played piano. They didn't party or get into trouble around town. Keith was careful with money in a way that bordered on meticulous, buying 50-cent sodas and reselling them at work for a few cents profit, quietly funneling every spare dollar into a college fund for Peter. And he was already planning years ahead, thinking about a future his son was still too young to imagine. This wasn't a family living recklessly. This wasn't a family on anyone's radar. But Keith, he'd been uneasy. And whatever was bothering him, he hadn't been wrong. Keith's mother, Joanne, would later say that he told her he wanted to move back to Mount Carmel, even if it meant quitting his job and figuring things out later.
I said, "Why are you coming back?" He said, "There's just too many things happening down here. There's people being murdered and robbed and just all kinds of meanness." And he said, "I don't like it."
It showed up in small moments. For example, one night a young woman knocked on their door asking to use the phone. Keith refused to let her inside. Not because he thought she was dangerous, but because he didn't feel safe opening the door to anyone at all. That was how tightly wound things had become, and for a churchgoer, that was no way to live. And by late 1987, the Derdeens had put their mobile home up for sale, and they were actively planning to leave Ena, to start over somewhere that felt quieter and safer, but they never got the chance. On the morning of November 18th, Keith didn't show up for his shift at the water treatment plant. That alone raised concern, and Keith didn't miss work. He didn't no-call, no-show. His supervisor tried reaching him throughout the day, calling the trailer again and again, but nobody answered. As the hours passed, the concern turned into something heavier. Eventually, the supervisor contacted Keith's parents. Though divorced, both still lived around Mount Carmel, which was about 80 miles away. They hadn't heard from their son and didn't know what the problem was, but if he wasn't at work and wasn't at home, something might be wrong. And Keith's father, Don, had a spare key, so he drove down to Ena to meet deputies from the sheriff's office there and let them go into the trailer. And inside, they found the family. Elaine, Peter, and a newborn baby girl were all in the same bed, but they weren't sleeping.
Investigators say the Derdeen family was brutally murdered. Elaine and their son Peter were bound and beaten to death. Elaine, 7 months pregnant at the time, prematurely gave birth during the beating to a little girl who was also killed.
Honestly, I don't even know how to wrap my mind around that level of cruelty. That's about as bad as it gets. And the bodies had been deliberately arranged in the bed and pulled in close together, covered as if someone had taken the time to make them look peaceful. The trailer itself was clean, so no signs of a struggle. There were no broken locks, no forced entry. The back door was standing open, but nothing appeared to be missing. A VCR sat untouched in the living room. A portable camera was still there, and cash and jewelry remained where they'd been left. This wasn't a burglary. Whatever had happened here, theft wasn't the point. And on top of it all, Keith, he was gone. His car, a red 1981 Plymouth, was missing too. And given what deputies knew at the time, the first theory was the most obvious one. That Keith had lost it for some reason, murdered his entire family, and then fled. A manhunt began almost immediately. Armed officers went to his mother's house expecting to find him there, and Joanne was adamant that it couldn't be true. She told them her son loved his family, that he would never hurt them. But most mothers don't think their sons could be killers, and the facts here were hard to ignore. Keith was missing, his family was dead, tucked away nicely as a final goodbye, and there were no other clear motives as to why anyone would do this, other than it was a personal attack. Well, that theory collapsed the next day. Hunters found Keith's body in a field about a mile away from his trailer. He had been shot 3 times in total, once in the skull, once on the right side of his face, and once through his left cheek. And his body had also been mutilated just below the waist. So Keith hadn't run, he'd been executed, and the whole family had in a very extreme way. Later that same day, Keith's car was located, and this is one of those details that adds another layer to an already messed up crime. The Plymouth was parked at the police station in Benton, about 11 miles south of the Derdeen home, just left there in plain sight, and inside the vehicle was covered in blood. Whoever committed this crime drove a blood-soaked car to the most visible place imaginable, parked it directly outside a police department, and then walked away. Now, Ena might have been going through a spell of violence at the time, but this was something different. Didn't feel like some local teens or thugs or whoever looking to kill someone, I guess. And to do what they did and leave a bloodied car with the police was a message. Whoever did this wasn't really improvising. Looked like they were working from a plan. The question was, why? And who planned something like this at all? With those kinds of questions in mind, the news started to absolutely terrorize Jefferson County. People who were already scared became completely paranoid. Gun sales went through the roof, and people started installing security systems in homes that had never needed them. The fear was everywhere. Meanwhile, 30 detectives were put on the case, working full-time. They interviewed more than 100 people and collected almost 150 pieces of evidence, but none of it led anywhere. Obviously, finding out who did this was the mission, but the biggest problem the investigators were facing was figuring out why this happened. What was the motive? I mean, even if the Derdeens somehow slighted a neighbor in some sort of way, this kind of revenge would be pretty extreme. The robbery, as mentioned, was ruled out immediately because nothing was taken. And the longer they sat and stared at this picture, the more it all started to feel like perhaps the killing itself was the point of it all. The ultraviolence was what they wanted, and that's all they wanted. The police looked hard at Keith's life for clues. Affairs, gambling, drugs, financial trouble, none of it surfaced. Toxicology reports later showed no drugs or alcohol in any of the victims. And like I said at the start, regular church-going folks. In a community already on edge, speculation filled the gaps. And this was the late 1980s, and the height of the satanic panic in America, and some people became convinced the murders had to be ritualistic. The mutilation of Keith's body and the circumstances surrounding Elaine's labor. To some, it felt like it fit a narrative they were already primed to believe. But specialists were brought in and they pushed back hard. Ritual killings, they explained, follow patterns, symbols, markings, objects left behind, repeated acts meant to communicate something. None of that was present here. There were no symbols, no staging beyond what was immediately apparent, no evidence of organized ritual behavior. Whatever happened to the Derdeen family wasn't part of some larger cult mythology. It was something else. And at that point, no one could say what. The Franklin County coroner, Robert Lewis, didn't think the family had been chosen randomly. He told reporters it seemed really personal and deliberate. But if it was personal, who could have hated this quiet church-going family that much? No one who knew them had a bad word to say about Keith or Elaine. So one theory was mistaken identity, and maybe someone thought the Derdeens were somebody else. Another theory, which Keith's mother, Joanne, suggested years later, was that someone tried to pressure Keith into selling drugs and he refused. Or maybe someone was interested in Elaine romantically and she turned them down, which led to this explosion of rage. But all these are just guesses. There's really no evidence for any of it. There's also the fact that Keith's body was found in a different location. Why? Did someone force him to drive to that wheat field at gunpoint? Was he killed first, or did he have to watch his family die in front of him?
I think they made Keith witness what happened because the duct tape was removed and Keith was taken about a mile away, shot execution style.
The timeline says all 4 victims died within an hour of one another, but the logistics of moving between 2 crime scenes that fast raises so many questions. Whoever killed them took their time at the trailer. They beat 3 people to death and cleaned up the scene and arranged the bodies in the bed. This isn't someone panicking or acting in a frenzy, so maybe there were more than one person involved. While the trailer was being worked on, maybe someone else had Keith in that field. But again, that doesn't exactly make a whole lot of sense either, because what's the motive of it all? And adding more people to the equation just complicates things further. The FBI sent profilers to look at the case, and even they admitted it didn't fit their normal patterns. Every piece of evidence seemed to point in a different direction, and every theory fell apart when you looked at it too closely. And for years, this case went cold, but Joanne Dardeen wouldn't let people forget. She called the detectives working the case all the time, offering tips she'd heard or asking for updates. She got signatures on a petition trying to get the Oprah Winfrey Show to tell the story, but the producers said no, that the crime was just far too brutal for daytime TV. America's Most Wanted eventually covered the story in 1998, but it didn't generate any new leads. Then, the next year, in 1999, police briefly looked into a serial killer named Angel Maturino Resendez. He traveled around the country, mainly hitching rides on freight trains, and would pick victims near railroad tracks, often beating them to death. The Dardeen trailer was near railroad tracks, and the method seemed to fit, but they could never connect him to the crime. And just when everything seemed lost in solving this case, then came a killer named Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells first came onto law enforcement's radar at the very end of 1999. On December 31st in Texas, he was arrested after attacking two young girls near Del Rio. 13-year-old Kayleen Harris was killed, and 10-year-old Crystal Searles survived, and it was her account that helped police identify the man responsible. Sells was eventually convicted and sentenced to death, and once he was locked in, with nothing left to lose, well, he started talking. A lot.
That was a disturbing interview. How cavalier he was about killing people. He described the thrill he got killing people.
From death row, Sells claimed responsibility for dozens of murders committed while he drifted across the country. And he put the number as high as 70. Investigators were able to confirm his involvement in at least 22 of them, enough to establish a clear pattern that Sells was a transient killer, comfortable with extreme violence, moving from place to place without roots, without witnesses who knew his name. So, when his confessions reached Illinois, detectives listened. Among the crimes Sells said he was responsible for were the murders of Keith, Elaine, Peter, and baby Casey Dardeen. According to him, he had been moving around the Midwest throughout the 1980s, sometimes working at carnivals, sometimes picking up odd jobs, and sometimes stealing what he needed. He traveled by hitchhiking or hopping freight trains, and he claimed that was how he'd come to know the Ena area. And what followed, though, was where his story began to fracture. In one version, Sells said he met Keith in November of 1987, either at a truck stop near Mount Vernon or at a local pool hall. The location changed depending on when he told it. In both tellings, Sells claimed Keith invited him back to the trailer for dinner. Afterward, Sells said Keith made a proposition involving Elaine, something Sells described as triggering an uncontrollable rage. He said he forced Keith into the car at gunpoint and drove him to the wheat field, killed and mutilated him, then returned to the trailer to kill Elaine and Peter because they were witnesses. He claimed the same anger explained why he killed the newborn as well. Later, though, he told a completely different story. In that version, Sells said he jumped off a freight train near Ena and noticed the Dardeen trailer because it had a for sale sign out front. He described drinking beer, waiting, and then knocking on the door under the pretense of being interested in buying the place. From there, he said he overpowered Keith, forced him to bind his wife and son with duct tape, and made him drive out to that field. He claimed he mutilated Keith and threatened to return part of him to Elaine and then shot him. Afterward, Sells said he went back to the trailer, killed the rest of the family, cleaned the scene, and drove Keith's car to Benton. Same outcome, completely different paths. And that was the problem. Besides the different accounts, well, there are also other problems with all of these stories. First off, Keith's friends and family found it impossible to believe he would invite a stranger home for dinner. I mean, this was a guy who was so paranoid about his family's safety that he wouldn't let a young woman use his phone. Why would he invite a 22-year-old drifter he just met into his home? And second, the idea that Keith made an advance just doesn't fit with anything anyone knew about him. No one who knew Keith ever thought he had any interest in men. The police found no evidence of that during their investigation. Detectives thought Sells invented that detail to make the crime seem justified, which is something he did when confessing to other murders too. He'd add these provocative elements to make himself look less monstrous. And third, when investigators pressed Sells on details that had never been made public, he struggled. He said Keith was shot in a specific seat of the Plymouth, but the evidence proved that was wrong. When they asked him how Elaine's body was positioned, he answered wrong at first, then guessed right, which could have just been a lucky guess. But Sells did get some things right. He correctly described watermelon-themed ceramics that were in the trailer. For some investigators, this was the smoking gun. I mean, how could he know that unless he'd been inside? But others pointed out that most of what Sells described had been reported in the media at some point. The stuff he got right could have come from news articles, and the stuff he got wrong showed he was guessing. Sells said he'd take police back to Ina and show them where he hid the evidence, but there was a problem. Texas law doesn't allow prisoners on death row to leave the state. Police in Illinois wanted to take him up on the offer, but Texas officials refused to make an exception. The state's attorney in Jefferson County, Douglas Hoffman, decided not to file murder charges against Sells. He said there were just too many inconsistencies in the story and not enough physical evidence. Hoffman said Sells was still the #1 suspect, but he couldn't prosecute based on a questionable confession and nothing else. Sells maintained until his death in 2014 that he did in fact kill the Derdeen family. But to this day, no one has been charged with the murders of Keith, Elaine, Peter, and baby Casey. And the case files take up more than 20 thick binders at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. DNA samples from the victims are still preserved, but there's no suspect DNA to compare them to. The evidence has been tested and retested, but nothing yet has produced a real lead. This case was a brutal one, no doubt, and worse, it still remains unsolved to this day, which is tragic. Friends and family of the Derdeens never got closure, and the town of Ina never got answers. Years have passed by, and with that, people in Ina have moved away or passed on, replaced by other individuals who've never heard of the Derdeens or know their story at all. The case stopped being something people talked about, but no matter how much time has passed, it will never truly be gone, not something this violent. And this family wasn't living on the edge of anything. They weren't tangled in crime or hiding secrets. They were a young family making careful plans and saving money and getting ready to move somewhere that felt safer. They did everything people tell you to do, and it still wasn't enough. And that, perhaps, is the hardest part to reconcile in all of this. So that's going to do it for today's episode of Everytown. Thanks for tuning in. If you want more dark true crime content, well, go check out our exclusive Vaults collection, where we have over 200 episodes you can pick and choose from over at patreon.com/scarymysteries. And remember to come on back here next week for another episode of Everytown filled with strange and mysterious stories, because you never know, maybe your town will be next.